Video game piracy, preservation, and emulation are topics that are not new to my channel. I've gone over them a number of times, from piracy in general to the annoyance of owning digital games, to bad DRM and why lost sales are not a real thing. I've even gone over adjacent topics like why NFTs don't belong in video games, and more recently, why Abandonware should be public domain. Links to all of those videos will be in the description if you feel so inclined. Now, I had assumed that I more or less said everything I wanted to say about these topics and everything relating to them, but fighting for preservation, true ownership, and accessibility is an ongoing task, and a few recent events have gotten me to consider making another video. First and foremost is the Stop Killing Games initiative, launched by Ross Scott of Accursed Farms. To give a Cliff Notes explanation, it's basically centered around online-focused or online-exclusive games, like MMOs and live service games, and how they can be snatched out of our possession with little to no advance in notice, and with no way to continue playing the game even though it might still be fully installed on our machines. And the publishers don't have to offer a refund even though they took away access to something you paid for. This problem is exacerbated by the simple fact that no one, not even the publishers themselves, are aware of how long the game will last, because it's entirely dependent on how successful it is. Obviously, in a perfect world, every online game is successful just enough to stay online indefinitely, but that's just not the world we live in. In reality, some games shut down less than a year after launch, and hopefully, in those severe cases, they're the ones to offer refunds. But not all publishers are so fair. What kicked this all off was Ubisoft, because of course it's them, and their game The Crew getting delisted. But it wasn't just delisted. In most cases, when a game you bought is delisted, it's not completely wiped from servers and you still retain the license, meaning you can still re-download and play it, which is good. But in The Crew's case, Ubisoft seems to have began revoking licenses for it, so you can't even install it anymore, let alone play it at all. Ross's initiative is to hopefully get legislation going to ensure that these live service games are still left in a fully playable state once official support for them ends, and without the need for any internet connection. It probably goes without saying, but I'm in total agreement with Ross's campaign here. I'm a huge supporter of ownership and being able to actually keep the things you pay for. Taking ownership away from players has been a pervasive idea that so many big companies are trying to push because the concept is associated with games that, when successful, see a lot of big gains. And these publishers are approaching this in a couple different ways. There's the aforementioned live service issue where a perfectly functional game is automatically rendered non-functional simply because it can't connect to a server somewhere and the developers can't bother sparing the extra effort to just add some basic features that allow the game to work without an internet connection. And then there's digital purchases in general, where online storefronts like Steam outright state that you don't actually own any game you buy, and instead own a license to play it that can be revoked at some time in the future. And then there's subscription services like Game Pass, which is just digital purchases again, but with even less ownership somehow. Oh, and there's also old DRM from over a decade ago that doesn't function anymore, so certain PC games from the late 2000s to the mid-2010s can't even be played. That's the subject of another great video by Tech Tangents, which I will also link to in the description. And to make matters worse, the live service issue isn't even fixed by owning a physical copy of the game, because even if the entire theoretically functional 1.0 version of the game is on the disc, it would still require server-side verification of some sort to actually let you play. Video games are the only medium where this is considered acceptable. Imagine having a physical, printed book that lost 95% of its pages, or a movie on Blu-ray that lost its entire second and third acts 5 years after you bought it. That would be utterly insane, right? Yet so many people make excuses for it happening to video games. It's almost astounding this practice remained legal for so long. The obvious solution here is what Ross proposed in his video. for developers to add offline functionality once a game is no longer supported officially. This is not an unreasonable request. In fact, Polyphony Digital did exactly this with Gran Turismo Sport. With its last update, they made the game's single-player content functional without an online connection, and no one lost their cars or settings after support ended. In the case of multiplayer-only games where single-player content is more or less non-existent, the addition of CPU-controlled bots would be more than enough. They don't even have to be all that human-like, just competent enough to allow for an entertaining match or two so players can at least go back and enjoy the game once in a while. That's really all this initiative is asking for, and all that we want companies to do. We're not asking them to move mountains and shift the heavens. It's pretty absurd that a company will put all this time, money, and manpower into a game that's designed from the ground up with the intention of being a forever game that wants people to play an hour or two every single day, but they can't be bothered to add a couple super basic functionalities that will just let people play it on their own once it's not supported anymore. Personally, I think it's a symptom of the greed that's overtaken the industry. Why bother being the slightest bit considerate of existing players if the gesture won't bring in money hand over fist anymore? A considerate act isn't going to put more money into the shareholders' pockets, so who cares? Terrible. If you agree, even just a bit, that live service games suffer from an ownership issue, I recommend checking out Ross's video on his Stop Killing Games campaign. A link will be in the description. The next topic I want to discuss is related in spirit to the ownership issue: physical media. I've gone into detail in the past about why physical media helps and is actually safer to own than a digital collection. Again, a link to that video will be in the description. But unfortunately, there's still a few other myths regarding physical games that people still like to parrot without actually looking into it. And some of those people are other YouTubers who, honestly, should probably know better. The biggest myth of all is physical game sales. This one's the most frustrating because every single time physical versus digital sales figures come up and are compared, they are heavily skewed towards digital because digital sales figures almost always include things like microtransactions, DLC, online subscription fees, and games that are only available digitally to begin with. And to make matters even muddier, sometimes it includes smartphone gaming and everything pertaining to it. If you include all of that shit, then yeah, obviously physical game sales are gonna look tiny in comparison. It makes the revenue discussion difficult, and people end up coming to the conclusion that physical purchasers barely even exist anymore, which is an outright lie. A lie disproven by Sony themselves, I should add. Almost exactly 1 year ago, Sony released their Game and Network Services segment presentation, going over PlayStation's success and their plans for the future. On the 8th page, there is a detailed graph that breaks down revenue type for the entire console gaming industry for calendar year 2022. From top to bottom, they are physical hardware, physical software, add-on content, digital full game, and subscriptions. It shows that physical software brought in $9 billion in revenue, and digital full game purchases also brought in $9 billion. When you actually separate DLC/microtransaction purchases and subscription fees and directly compare digital full game purchases with physical full game purchases, you see they're selling pretty much the same amount. And keep in mind, there's a lot of games that only release digitally too, so this is still somewhat skewed towards digital's favor. And this chart represents the entire console gaming space, not just PlayStation. Both figures are so close, you cannot say that physical is failing without also suggesting digital full game purchases are failing too, which is obviously just crazy. Even if the gap gets a tiny bit bigger as the years pass, physical games are still a multi-billion-dollar sector of the industry. It would be idiotic to completely toss it out. If the next generation of consoles are digital only and don't even come with disk drives, it's not because digital is failing. It's because platform holders want physical to fail, because, as we've established, the big publishers don't want you to truly own anything. The next couple of physical myths I want to touch on typically appear hand in hand. They're the myths that most physical games are not playable from the disc, and most physical games need patches to function. These myths are really annoying to see spouted on social media because, unlike the revenue myth, these don't even have reports that could mislead you. So when people parrot these two, they're just making an assumption they pulled right out of their ass. If you actually sit and think about how many dozens, if not hundreds sometimes, of games still get physical releases per year, it becomes clear that this sounds ridiculous. I'm going to debunk these myths pretty quickly and easily by pointing to a specific website that decisively destroys them. DoesItPlay.org. It's a website dedicated specifically to testing physical game releases so they can discover if it's possible to install the full game from the disc, play it offline, and play that version of the game from beginning to end without needing patches to fix it up. That's the entire purpose of this website, and as of making this video, they've already tested over 2,000 games, and 93% of them are completely playable offline, and 75% of them do not require any type of download to access all content, and their performance is still good enough to not require patches to fix. There's also 15% of games that are recommended you download patches for, but even if you don't, the story-crucial content is still playable. Meaning there's a total of 90% of games that don't require patches to just function. So when anyone says that most games aren't playable from the disc or most games need patches to function, they are stating an outright falsehood, whether they know it or not. Now I want to touch on preservation itself, specifically personal media preservation, as in ensuring that your own library stays protected. I've seen an odd thing happen a couple times in the past several months where people discover that disk rot exists, and they take this to mean that owning physical games is actually useless in the long run. Now, I hate to break it to you, but hard drives and solid-state drives can also rot and fail all the same. This isn't a matter of choosing storage that doesn't fail. They are all capable of failing in one way or another. This is a matter of simply taking care of your own shit. All of your games, all of your discs, everything, are the same as all other electronics. They will last longer if kept in a cool, dry room. That's it. Store your stuff in a room that doesn't experience extreme temperatures, especially heat, or extreme humidity, and it will likely last decades. I still have functioning PS1 games and music CDs from the 90s, because I live in a dry part of the country, in a house with proper heating and cooling. If you do live in a very humid region, you might need to invest in a dehumidifier. But if you're super serious about preserving your games, you might already have one. If there is any weakness to owning a physical copy of a game, it's the fact that, by itself, it's still not a totally foolproof way of ensuring the long-term preservation of your things. I'm obviously a supporter of physical media and will always prioritize them over digital, but that single physical copy is not perfect preservation in itself. It's close, because it represents a sort of master copy you own that cannot be taken from you without warning by the publisher. For most people, that's good enough, which is fair. But if you're someone who wants to go all the way and have redundancy on top of redundancy, then the best way to preserve your things is to have DRM-free copies. This is where things can get kinda complicated, because making your own backup copies of physical games that are on Blu-ray can be quite the chore. You'll need to jailbreak the console itself so the copies can actually work on it, and then spend a lot of time decrypting and dumping the game. And of course, there's also the space issue, because if you're someone who plays a lot of big AAA games, a 1TB drive might only fit about 10 games, maybe fewer. It's something that can cost a lot of time and money, so I don't blame people for just sticking to the physical copy they have. If you're copying PC games, it'll be much easier, especially since the games you own are probably already cracked from whatever DRM they might have. and uploaded to a piracy site or available on some torrent tracker, so really, all you probably need to do is just download the game again from one of those places, and you're all set. Now finally, I want to touch on an event that happened earlier in the year: Nintendo taking down Yuzu. I almost made a video about this when it happened, but other more popular channels said more or less what I was going to say. But since we're all here, I might as well throw in my 2 cents so you hear my words out of my own mouth. You might have guessed by now, assuming you've never seen any of my videos before, I have no love for Nintendo as a company because of their hyper-aggressive stance towards piracy and emulation. As far as I'm concerned, they are the most anti-consumer out of all 3 console manufacturers. They even tried to get scans of 30-year-old issues of Nintendo Power taken off the Internet Archive, even though Nintendo offers no official way of viewing those issues themselves, proving they would rather set fire to their own history than let fans have anything for free. Anyway, there was a lot of conjecture about why Nintendo was going after Yuzu, but if you check out the documents directly, you'll see that the stated reason is because Yuzu circumvents Nintendo's software encryption to facilitate piracy, and in the documents they evoke DMCA. There's a lot of implications here. Before we start though, obligatory, I am not a lawyer, so take my thoughts on the matter with a grain of salt, okay? First, let's talk about decryption keys. Now, I honestly never used Yuzu myself, believe it or not, but from what I understand, Yuzu did not actually bundle the decryption keys with the program, and instead gave instructions on how to acquire them. Apparently, this is what angered Nintendo, at least according to the documents. This is strange because it's understood that bundling decryption keys with an emulator would be far more legally risky than just giving instructions on how to do it. In fact, several actively developed emulators that exist today already do bundle decryption keys with the program, including emulators of other Nintendo platforms. However, let's pretend Yuzu did bundle keys with the program. Would that still be illegal? Again, I'm not a lawyer, but there's some discussions to be had over this. Section 1201 of the US Code goes into detail about circumventing copyright protection systems, and it does mention decryption, but it doesn't mention the word keys or emulation specifically. Furthermore, subsection F also goes into detail about reverse engineering exceptions, which emulator decryption keys could fall under, maybe. I also mentioned that Nintendo evoked DMCA in the documents, which is another talking point because it's not even clear as to whether decryption keys are copyrightable or not. Unsurprisingly, this is something left vague and open to interpretation, as many copyright laws are. I know some people might suggest that more tech-savvy legislators should sit down and make some better laws regarding this stuff, but let's be honest here. If they do that, they're more likely to make laws that favor the corporations instead of the consumers. So it's probably for the best that these laws are left vague, so there's still a chance for consumers to fight back when a company wants to throw their weight around. Sadly, Yuzu did not put up that much of a fight to begin with, and decided to settle only a week later. Nintendo accomplished their goal of putting some pressure on them and making them fold because, at the end of the day, Nintendo was a major corporation that could drag this out until Yuzu became broke if they wanted, even though there's plenty of legal precedents that Yuzu could have leaned on to protect themselves, at least regarding the stuff Nintendo mentioned on paper. At least, that probably would have worked out if the Yuzu team, Tropic Haze, hadn't put themselves into a corner. Yuzu wasn't the only Switch emulator that existed, yes, but there is the issue of the developers making a spectacle out of their success. They had a Patreon raking in tens of thousands of dollars a month, and a Discord channel where they were saying all kinds of self-incriminating stuff, practically painting a giant neon-colored target on their back with a sign that said, "Nintendo lawyers shoot here." I'm still not necessarily going to side with Nintendo on this, because I do believe emulator developers should be allowed to make money, and a lot of them actually do. Yuzu isn't the only one with a Patreon. But Nintendo probably wouldn't have cared about or even noticed Yuzu's existence if the members of Tropic Haze just kept a low profile like most other emulator developers do. So remember, Discord is not a safe place to talk about stuff that'll get you in legal trouble. But this lawsuit also revealed another big detail about Nintendo. In the legal documents, Nintendo outright admits that being able to play old Nintendo games on Nintendo hardware is very important to them. This is interesting because it basically confirms what everyone already suspected. Nintendo wants to corner retro gaming. They hate emulation because it takes away from their ability to monopolize the activity of playing old classics. You might think they mean just Nintendo-developed games and properties specifically, but I don't think they've ever made that distinction in all of their attempts to squash emulators and piracy sites. Plus, the Nintendo Switch Online service does include non-Nintendo properties, so I do think it can be reasonably assumed that Nintendo wants to completely own the ability to play all games for old Nintendo systems on current Nintendo hardware. And the reason why this is a bad idea is because, frankly, we cannot trust them to offer that. It's infeasible. There's over 3,000 NES and SNES games, and only about 150 of them or so are on NSO. Do we actually believe Nintendo will put the rest of them on there? And even if they do, can they guarantee access to them forever? I doubt it. So yeah, I'm not on Nintendo's team here, and this whole Yuzu situation pretty much reaffirms that. And that more or less does it for everything I wanted to touch on regarding game preservation, emulation, and piracy topics I've seen pop up the last few months. I'll probably return to this topic when others arise, but as of right now, I've said pretty much everything I want to say. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.